Is Ocean Software the best software house in UK games history? Well, they were certainly one of the biggest and most prolific. In the 80s and the early 90s they were also tremendously successful, and a lot of people like me, well, we look back upon them very fondly. Ocean do sometimes come in for a bit of a kick-in due to some pretty lousy games here and there, but they also released plenty of quality, titles that people loved dearly, especially on the microcomputers. They claimed at one point to be the biggest games company in the world. Was that ever true? Maybe, maybe not, but they would have definitely been in the conversation. Anyway, one of the reasons for their great success, and probably the thing that they're most associated with, is licensed games. That is to say, tie-in games for movies, TV programmes, sports, celebrities, bands, fast food chains, a lot of different stuff. Ocean released a ton of these licensed games. In fact, they released well over 100. Gary Bracey, the company's software supremo and leader of the troops, was often in charge of procuring these licenses, and was a big part of the company's success because of it. So what better way to celebrate these licenses than by looking at every single one of them? Yes, I have tried here to cover all of Ocean's licensed games, including the multiple versions for different titles. Hopefully I haven't missed anything. Even the most hardened Ocean fans may well be surprised at the broad scope of their licensed games when they're put together like this. An ambitious project to be sure, but hey, it's certainly a lot of fun, and there's quite a few really good games here, although needless to say there are also some terrible ones. We'll be doing this roughly chronologically, starting at the early days of the Spectrum and finishing with their last one on the N64. We have a lot of games, so we probably shouldn't waste any more time here. This is a look at every Ocean Software licensed game. Lord help me. As far as I can tell, this little thing here is the first Ocean game that could be considered a licensed game. Royal Birkdale Championship Golf. An exciting way to kick things off, I'm sure you'll agree. Now, I'm not sure if they'd have to get the licence from the real course, but I've included it anyway. This is from 1983, a time when Ocean were gradually shifting from their original early identity as Spectrum Games to the name by which they'd become famous, and, well, it's pretty much what you would expect from a ZX Spectrum golf game from 1983. Very, very simple indeed, and not the most playable of games now. The next licence will definitely be more exciting. This is probably the first official proper licensed game, and it's for nothing less than Wimpy. What a great way to kick things off. The iconic burger brand with all of its Bender in a Bun, Brown Derby and Knickerbocker glory is here for you to enjoy. Mr. Wimpy kicks off with a little game where you have to move your tools of fast food legend from one side to the other, which is very exciting indeed, especially as you have to keep watching out for mysterious holes that are here to thwart the expediency of delicious burgers. After this, the game settles into what you would expect it to be, a microcomputer Burger Time clone that's actually a fine representation of the classic arcade game. Oh, and it also has a beeper version of the Wimpy jingle. While this perhaps isn't the greatest game under the bun, it's actually okay enough, much like a lot of the early Ocean's other arcade clones like Road Frog, Monster Muncher or Armageddon. It's just that this one has a rather fitting licence attached. Our third game is the first really big licence game, in all honesty. Ocean had attracted decent attention early on with games like their conversion of Hunchback and their take on Donkey Kong, simply called Kong, but getting the licence for a game starring Daley Thompson, probably the UK's most famous sportsman at the time, was a big deal, and just in time for the 1984 Olympic Games too. The folks at Ocean were pretty anxious watching Daley, hoping he wouldn't get injured or falter during the Decathlon. But of course, he won, and broke the world record, which undoubtedly helped the game plenty. The game itself, Daley Thompson's Decathlon, is pretty good. It is pretty much a clone of Konami's Track and Field, but it's a very good one, and one of the microcomputer's most infamous joystick breakers. A million sticks were quite literally waggled to death thanks to this classic title. Ocean would go back to the Daley Thompson world pretty sharpish. The sequel, Daley Thompson's Super Test, would come out in 1985. You might think that this would be a clone of Hypersports, but this one's actually pretty different, besides which Ocean did an official port of that game. Super Test features a wider range of events. You have the usual athletics-based ones, but you also have things like rowing, pistol shooting, ski jump, and even taking penalties. Now, I don't think that penalty kicks have ever been an Olympic event, but hey-ho. This game is okay, I suppose. It's nowhere near as good as either Hypersports or Daley Thompson's Decathlon, with some of the events falling on their arse a bit. I mean, things like ski jump can frankly just sod off. It's better graphically, but it's also better when it's sticking to the more tried and tested speedkin smashing and cheetah crushing waggle games. Ocean were never exactly known for their text adventures. In fact, this one here might be the only one that they ever did. But it is a text adventure for the film The Neverending Story, complete with a nice version of Le Mans' theme song running all the way through it, courtesy of Fred Gray, that I can't play because it gets copyright claimed. Now, I'm not a text adventure person in the slightest, but from what I know, this is generally considered to be an okay one, even if it is by the infamous Canvas, who we'll certainly be getting to soon. One thing I can tell you is that sadly there's no special messages for putting swear words into the parser, which is the one thing I really know how to do in text adventure games. Anyway, the music and illustrations do make this more polished than a fair few text adventures, and whether it's a simple adventure by the late Ian Weatherburn or not, The Neverending Story is an important milestone. This is, after all, the first licensed game by Ocean to be based off of a movie. Obviously, it will not be the last. You want another odd licence? Well, here you go. It's Roland's Ratrace, a game based on the TV puppet Roland Rat, star and saviour of the breakfast TV show TV-AM, and most definitely a British 1980s icon. No, really, he took TV-AM from a show that nobody watched to one that millions watched. Look, we were desperate, okay? In this game, our rodent hero must traverse the sewers of London, finding pieces of a puzzle and eventually rescuing his friends so that they can all get to the studio for TV-AM on time. Simple enough really, the sort of arcade adventure-ish game that you see a lot of on the spectrum, and not one that exactly holds up today. If it was even particularly good back then, in all honesty. If you are going to play this, then the C64 version is definitely the one to go for. It's much nicer graphically, and also has music, whereas the Specky one is a bit of a mess. I have seen a comment saying that the Specky version was completed in all of 2 weeks by Denton Designs after the programmers originally assigned to the project had done absolutely nothing after 2 months, but obviously I can't fully confirm that. Anyway, it's a fun licence to have, but the game itself is pretty naff. Not as naff as this one, mind you. A licensed game for the Transformers isn't exactly a shock, and nor is a licensed game for the Transformers being bad a shock. There were lots of dreadful ones, especially back in these times. In this game you control a variety of Autobots and you have to find pieces of a cube, all the while battling the Decepticons. Sounds a bit familiar to the last game, doesn't it? A lot of licensed games took on this go around and find pieces of something formula. Anyway, you can walk around and fly, but the controls are pretty bad and it's very easy to die, making this one quite the frustrating experience. The only good thing I can say, I suppose, is that it's nowhere near as bad as that infamously horrific Famicom Transformers game. Honestly though, that's about it. Here's something a hell of a lot better. Now, as far as I can tell, Ocean only handled Datasoft's legendary Bruce Lee on the Spectrum, porting the game over from the C64 original. In fact, this is a direct collaboration between Ocean and US Gold, with Ocean developing and US Gold publishing. Now, even though the two companies were very much bonded together, that didn't happen all that often. Anyway, said original game is one of my favourite C64 titles, and happily the Spectrum version is great too. The graphics are perfectly fine for the system, but the speed and fun of jumping around and getting into the odd scrape is also totally present and correct. This is unquestionably one of the very best microcomputer platform games, and one that's held up way better than a lot of others. This is an absolutely recommended must-play right now sort of game, and no mistake. Okay, here's another important licensed game, and a damned cool license to boot. It's time for Frankie. From the time when Frankie Goes to Hollywood were hell-bent on not just being a big music group, but were aiming for world domination, much in the same way that another bunch of lads from Liverpool had previously done. While they didn't quite get there, Frankie Mania did produce some great singles, iconic t-shirts, and this game, one that's not just based on the band's music, but also their imagery and ethos. It was up to Liverpool's own Denton Designs to make such a game, and they absolutely nailed it, creating a very ambitious game for 1985 that was a huge critical and commercial hit. In fact, one magazine even ranked it later as the greatest C64 game ever made. Not bad at all, really. The marketing also followed suit. This is certainly Ocean's most promoted game to date, with tons of press inches and a package that featured 2 cassettes. Obviously there's the game, but you also get a live and previously unreleased version of Relax, as well as chiptunes, or what Ocean then called Datatune, versions of songs such as Welcome to the Pleasure Dome, while also having a voiceover featuring hints on how to play the game. It's a pretty big package, whether you were a Frankie fan or not. Frankie can be a little cryptic, especially if you're trying to play it now, but I'll explain as best as I can. You're in the town of Mundainsville, and your goal is to become a full and real person so that you can gain access to the Pleasure Dome, upping your stats in faith, love, war, and pleasure as you go. You do this by completing tasks and picking up items. Pleasure pills, milk bottles, tapes, money bags. Some of these items have a purpose, and some are red herrings, literally even, but you must pick all of them up and use them at least once. Some tasks are set in Mundainsville, such as the big whodunit quest to find out who's murdered Mr. Average, where you get various clues as you move through the town, while the others require you to complete minigames which you access by using a video on a TV. So yeah, there's a lot to do, and it all plays pretty smoothly. When you consider some games from 1985, there's a hell of a lot more to this one. It's good on every platform, but the C64 version is the definite standout. And yeah, I would say it's an essential game to play, one of Ocean's most iconic tie-in games for sure. Maybe not the greatest C64 game ever, but certainly excellent. Geez, we go from Frankie Goes to Hollywood to this pile of dung. Ocean's licensed games are certainly not all winners, and this game based on It's a Knockout? Well, this is certainly horrible. For those of you who are unfamiliar, It's a Knockout was a variety TV show where members of the public, or indeed members of the royal family in one edition, perform various silly challenges that wouldn't look out of place in a fair or whatever, with commentary provided by the now thoroughly disgraced Stuart Hall. The game itself is a little bit more fantastical, with some of its tasks seen as they feature volcanoes or dinosaurs, but that doesn't make the game any less of a deathly dull pile of cat vomit. The games are sub-Tiger Electronics quality, the presentation utterly miserable, the whole vibe being one of not giving a crap about putting this game out there, no matter how terrible it was. But then, what do you expect from a studio like Canvas? Amazingly, there's worse games to come from them. Unfortunately, we do have a fair bit of crap to wade through here, so bear with me. Street Hawk's another big miss. You might be surprised that this one got a game, seeing as the TV show was quite short-lived, but it did. You play as the titular crime fighter, you ride your bike and you take down perpetrators in this game that kind of comes off as a poor man's Spy Hunter. It's not terrible as such, just aggressively bland. The more interesting part of this story is that there was another edition of the game, one that was worked on by the legendary Joffa Smith and Nigel Alderton. However, this version was an absolute desperate rush job, put together pretty much in days so that Ocean could fulfill orders from K's catalogues because the development on the regular version was taking too long. This version was also offered as a free gift to subscribers of Crash magazine, hence why it's often known as Street Hawk Subscribers Edition. It was also so dreadful that Ocean eventually had to offer some actual games to subscribers as alternative choices, despite it being a free gift. Needless to say, both versions of this game are best avoided. Oh dear. Knight Rider here is another pretty sorry mess of a title, I'm afraid. Take Kit on several journeys across an America where everything looks the same and the roads are polluted with helicopters for you to shoot down, and then do a little bit of mazing around every now and again in between long and deathly boring journeys. This is a very typical example of the lazy licensed game where everything just feels thoroughly half-baked. A bad game indeed that's hardly worth spending any energy on. Get it away. Yes, the science fiction TV series V got a computer game. Here it is, this time on the ZX Spectrum. It's not one of Ocean's most famous licensed games, and it's kind of easy to see why. Graphically it's pretty nice for the ZX Spectrum, but this is another one of those games where frankly, if you've got any idea at all what's going on, you're a way better person than I am. From what I can gather, the path through this game is so utterly cryptic and out there that it makes the aforementioned Frankie Goes to Hollywood seem like bloody Donkey Kong in comparison. And so before too long and before you ever have the slightest hope of figuring it out, you'll most likely just get bored and frustrated and shut the game off. Nothing of value will be lost by doing so. And yes, I have to cover this bloody game again. Unquestionably the very worst licensed game that Ocean put their name to, and after actually playing them all, I can officially confirm that nothing even comes remotely close to Highlander, one of the worst games ever made. The lack of control in this lazy and turgid hopeless excuse for a fighting game still frankly beggars belief. As far as gameplay goes, it's a black hole. There is nothing to be found. No, the large sprites do not really help matters or improve anything. Everything about this is beyond the pale. Now I have of course covered this before and addressed the urban legend that the cost of the licence was so expensive that Ocean tanked the game on purpose. That wasn't really the case. The real case was that Canvas, who Ocean farmed this out to, simply did not give a shit. That much is evident by this and almost all of their other games, especially the licensed ones. They had good people on staff, one can credit Stephen Kane and Simon Butler for the graphics here at the least, but most of the people at the top just did not care and they put rubbish out, thinking Ocean wouldn't notice. Of course they did, and eventually stopped using Canvas altogether. The sort of game where they would ask Bob Wakelin to make the cover really good so that there would at least be one little thing of worth in the entire package. Makes any other infamously bad fighting game look like it's ready for the main slot at EVO. Just a complete disaster. Finally, here's something decent to get my teeth into. We have a couple of different Cobra games to look at, but here's the famous one, the Spectrum one, as coded by Joffa Smith. As the story goes, Joffa had the choice of doing a game based on either Cobra or Top Gun. He didn't like either movie but thought Cobra had more potential, and so he ended up making, well, this. Does it have much relation to Cobra? Well, no. You have an interpretation of the Rocky theme, violent prams, women in flapper dresses toting rocket launchers, and your main move is a headbutt. Now, I'm not sure if any of this was in the Cobra movie, I have to say. Anyway, the main aim is to pick up the various weapons, rescue your damsel, and beat the enemy waves. Then you move on, and the levels get weirder and weirder. It's a tough game, but quite addictive, and the technical quality with smooth and even parallax-ish scrolling on the 48K Spectrum is outstanding. It's a pretty damn good game from one of the Spectrum's master programmers, and it's a shame he didn't make too many other weird takes on other licensed properties, if this interpretation of Cobra is anything to go by. The other two Cobra games on the C64 and Amstrad CPC are both very different and altogether straighter interpretations of the movie. Unfortunately, they're both also kind of terrible. The C64 game is a completely boring and slow run and gunner. It does at least have some nice title music, just not fun at all to play. The CPC version is even worse. It's just another run and gunner, but a bit different, and also very jerky with nasty controls. It is a little bit weirder in that Sly Stallone here can take a rocket to the face handily, but the birds flying around will kill him instantly. However, such weirdness hardly improves the enjoyment levels. Both of these games are awful, and obviously you should just stick to Joffa's ZX Spectrum one. Naturally, Top Gun would end up getting a game too. The adaptation that was rejected by Joffa was picked up by Mike Lamb, and the end result is, well, a combat flight sim game, as you might expect. Probably the best thing about this game is either the opportunity to have a two-player dogfight, or the nice and pretty screen you get before the game starts. Other than that, well, a flight sim type game on the Spectrum kind of goes as well as you would expect. It's simple at least, but certainly frustrating against the computer, and there's not an awful lot to see. Mike Lamb would at least go on to much bigger and better adaptations, that we will be seeing soon. A licensed American football game? On the ZX Spectrum? Yes, indeedy. This is actually a thing, and it's called Super Bowl. Specifically, it's for the 20th Super Bowl in 1986, and you and a friend can pick either the Chicago Bears or the New England Patriots. We do certainly enjoy a bit of gridiron every now and again, although our understanding of the sport might be a bit weaker over here. Helpfully, Ocean included a short audio guide on how to play American football on the flip side of this tape. Anyway, this game is two-player only, so I can't say an awful lot else about it. It doesn't seem like a particularly exciting football game or anything, but then this did come out in 1986 on the frickin' Spectrum, so I'm not sure what sort of standard you would expect. I presume it didn't sell well. It is pretty obscure as far as their licensed games go. Ugh, God. The only thing I'm thankful for here is that Miami Vice is the last time that we're going to see the name of Canvas in this video. As you might expect, this is another horrible game by them. Miami Vice is a game where you apparently go around and chase criminals in the expected fashion, although I can't say I've ever experienced that much as the controls are so slow and broken that usually I just crash endlessly on the first frickin' turn. Another completely irredeemable stinker by Canvas then. It was probably around this time that Ocean scrubbed them out of their Filofax for good. Here's another pretty major tie-in title for both the C64 and the Spectrum. Certainly a big movie license anyway, although the quality of the game is a bit variable. Rambo First Blood Part 2 is the second Sly Stallone based IP that Ocean has handled, and it's a lot more faithful than Joffa's take on Cobra. Here you're in the jungle, killing endless enemies with either throwing knives or big ass guns. It's not quite a straightforward run and gunner, mind. You have to explore a little, finding your weapons, going into the base to rescue POWs, and even flying a helicopter by the game's end. It's the sort of game that would actually take 5 minutes to complete once you've learned it, but it's so freaking hard that this might take a while. You only get one life and you die very quickly. It's okay, I suppose. The C64 music by Martin Galway is very good, but it does sound a bit like The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. The ZX Spectrum version of the game is also pretty fine. It's obviously got different graphics, but it still has much the same levels. In fact, it is a bit more forgiving. You do get multiple lives here, however you do only die in one hit. So yeah, swings and roundabouts. Either way, this is a decent take on the old top-down shooter. Now here is a very good one. 1986's Batman does in fact have the honour of being the very first licensed game starring the Dark Knight, and it's an isometric action-adventure from the brilliant John Whitman and Bernie Drummond, who'd first made their mark at Ocean with the excellent Match Day. This game, which has aesthetics that are more in line with the old 60s TV show, features you going around the Batcave and assembling the different parts of your Batcraft in order to rescue Robin. But needless to say, it's a lot tougher than that sounds, with platforming challenges and cryptic viciousness that'll be familiar to those who've played the likes of Nightlore. But Whitman and Drummond would take the old Filmation style to another level, both with this and their next isometric game, the almighty Head Over Heels. A tough game, but a very good one indeed, and a great debut for the Caped Crusader. This game is pretty good on both the Spectrum and the Amstrad, although an announced C64 version never materialised, perhaps because the computer itself did struggle with isometric 3D games like this, as opposed to the Speccy and CPC. This one here is a little novel because, well, it's based on a novel. I don't know, you don't seem to get too many licensed games based on books in this era, and usually on the specky layer text adventures like, say, The Hobbit. Anyway, Tai-Pan is a side-scrolling adventure game based on James Clavell's book of the same name. It's the second book in his Asian saga, of which the most famous book is undoubtedly Shogun. Now my reckoning here is that Ocean wanted to get a license for Shogun, but were beaten to it by Virgin, who released a Shogun game in 1986, so they settled for Tai-Pan instead. Anyway, yeah, this is one of those games where I don't have much of a clue as to what's going on. I don't think this sort of game has aged particularly well, but looking at magazine scores from the time, it does appear to have reviewed very favourably, with a bunch of scores in the 90s and whatnot. So I don't really want to say it's bad, it's just a sort of game that's a bit lost to time if you're not already intimately familiar with it. It's time for Short Circuit. Ocean released games based on the adventures of Johnny Five for the Speccy, Amstrad CPC and Commodore 64, and they're all a little different. The Spectrum one is what I'm most familiar with, and it's split into two parts. The first is an adventure game where you have to get Johnny out of Nova Labs, finding items and putting them in the right place. Kinda like a regular point and clicker basically, and not too bad to mess around with. The second part is the action bit. You're running away from Nova Labs, avoiding rocks and other obstacles as you go. You can skip straight to this part, foregoing the adventure entirely if you wish. However, there is a bit of a snag. This action part is unfinished and cannot be completed, basically making it an endless runner where you're only playing for score. Yes, Ocean released this game without completing it, and it won't be the last time we see such a thing. The game does have fantastic music, mind you. That's just about worth the load alone. The CPC version is basically the same as the Speccy version, with one obvious and important difference. Yes, they actually finished this one, meaning you might want to grab this if you actually want a full and complete adventure with Johnny. The music's different and good here too, although not as good as the Specky. The C64 one's a bit different. The adventure part here has been totally changed up, although the action bit is mostly similar. It's okay, I suppose. I'm not a big fan of this one's music. These games aren't bad. I have a lot of memories of the Spectrum game from playing it as a kid, and I still enjoy it. It is playable for sure, even if it does commit an unforgivable sin. Here's one that's slightly tenuous, but Ocean's name is on it. This is Emilio Butragueno Futbol, a Spanish game that's mostly credited to Toposoft, but you do find Ocean there on the cover. Now, I don't believe this got an English release as such. There's no reviews for this in any of the UK mags, and all the text here is naturally in Spanish. Hey ho, it's here. This is a game licensed by the legendary Real Madrid striker, and it's a fairly average game of football for the time. It's not the worst I've played, and it pretty much sticks to a formula inspired by the almighty Tekken World Cup arcade game. That said, there's not much here that would make me choose this over something like Micropro Soccer or Match Day. While we're on sports games of Spanish origin, here's a look at 1987's Basketmaster. This one did get a UK release through Ocean's Imagine label, and while it was simply known as Basketmaster here, the original dynamic game is called Fernando Martin Basketmaster, meaning that it counts. The license here is for the Spanish basketball player who became something of an idol in the 80s, due to being the first Spaniard to play in the NBA, signing for the Portland Trail Blazers in 1986 and, tragically, dying young in a car accident in 1989. As you might expect, Fernando Martin's game was a pretty huge release in Spain. I believe it's one of the biggest selling titles in Spain on the Specky. The game's actually perfectly fine. It's one-on-one basketball and definitely meant for two players, although you can play against the computer. One neat touch is that the game does feature slow-motion zoomed-in replays for dunks. The computer will most likely annihilate you, but this should be a good laugh with a friend. Also, you've got to love the grinning animated caricature of Martin on dynamic splash screen. So, who remembers Madballs? They were a big toy line in the 80s. Foam bouncing balls with some rather gruesome designs about them, these balls seemed to catch fire, soon expanding to a cartoon, a comic, and yes, a Madballs computer game by Ocean. I almost didn't include this one until I finally caught it on an official list of all the company's licenses, but it is here, and yeah, it's rubbish. This is very strange. Your goal, apparently, is to fight other Madballs and bounce them around, convincing them to become a part of your team. Other Madballs apparently have different abilities, you can swap between them by landing in a dustbin, and you win once you collect all the Madballs. Solely in lay sets anyway. I can't do any of that. In this game you just bounce around uncontrollably and you only get one life, so your first plays will probably be measurable in seconds as it's so easy to fall off the edge. It's pretty fair to say that this game's not a good representation of the balls in question, and it reviewed terribly. Much like most people's old collections of these balls, this one is best left up in a dusty loft. Or indeed, a bin. From one of Ocean's more obscure licenses to another one of their biggies, and one that does make some people scratch their heads. Here's Platoon, Ocean's licensed game based on Oliver Stone's huge Vietnam War drama. Now, while I've not checked this, I wouldn't be surprised if Platoon was the only Best Picture Oscar winner that also had a tie-in computer game associated with it. Anyway, the Platoon game doesn't necessarily go in for the harrowing drama, depictions of evil and squad-centric tension that make up the film, opting instead for a run and gun in the jungle. And generally speaking, a decent one. You may well get lost and the game will certainly throw enemies at you out of nowhere, but I guess that kind of fits in with this licence. There are a lot of versions of Platoon, and they're all generally the same. You start by navigating a maze, finding explosives and blowing up a bridge, then you go into first person to get through the tunnel system. The third part is a shooting gallery in a dugout, and then the final mission is a third person search and destroy affair. So yeah, there's lots of different bits here. I think this is a pretty important game in the Ocean licensed canon, as it kind of set their formula for having a whole lot of different styles of play in these licensed games, and we're going to see more of that going forward. Anyway, of all the versions of this, whether it's a Micro or even the NES where it came out via Sunsoft, you're best playing this on C64, primarily for the utterly outstanding music. It's not a great game, but it's still probably worth a bit of a play. The original kin of Ocean's licensors is back for one final go-round. Yes, Daley Thompson's here again with his Olympic challenge, and we've got two versions of this one for the Spectrum and one for the Amiga. Both are pretty similar, but very different in how they're presented graphically. The Specky one looks nice and is very much a 1:8K game, while the Amiga uses a lot of digitised images and tries to go for a more TV type presentation. In both cases though, this game is nowhere near Daley Thompson's Decathlon or even Super Test. I don't know, it just doesn't feel as fun to play. You do have some very tedious gym sections that you should probably skip over, seeing as they just represent nothing but a minute or more of bashing buttons. You also have the gimmick of having to choose the correct trainers for each event. If you pick one, then poor Daley will barely be able to move. I guess this exists as a sort of in-game copy protection, although it does allow the game to sneak in some extra licensing from Adidas. Alas, by this stage the shine has worn off these old school joystick wagglers, and you're much better off sticking with the classic Daley Thompson's Decathlon. Old Bats is back again too with his second game, the rather intriguing Batman the Caped Crusader. This is another adventure game of sorts, a side-scrolling one where you do get a bit of action, but you also have a lot of items to collect and puzzles to solve. You also get two separate stories to go through, A Bird in the Hand and A Fate Worse Than Death, where you'll be going up against the Penguin and the Joker respectively. It's not a bad game, although the best part is definitely the presentation. I love the way that the game switches from scene to scene as if they're panels in a comic book, and apparently this was devised by Joffa Smith and Charles Davis. All in all, a perfectly okay game from Special Effects. Definitely not their best, but more interesting than the average licensed side-scroller from Ocean. I've got both the 8-bit C64 and the 16-bit Amiga versions on show here, although I would play this one on the C64 first, mainly for the absolutely superb SID music in this game. And here we have the return of Sly Stallone and John Rambo. This time obviously with Rambo 3 because, well, the Rambo 3 film was out and that's how these licensed games work. Rambo 3 is a top-down game for the most part, one where you have to infiltrate bases, find useful items and rescue folk. You can evade guards if you choose, although really this isn't exactly Metal Gear. You're going to be doing a fair bit of fighting, and there is a proper shooting gallery section at the end. On the whole, this one very much falls into the average department. I've played many worse games, but this isn't one I'd ever particularly want to go back to. One thing that does amuse me here is how Rambo's health is represented by his face gradually turning into a skull and becoming a bit of an abomination, especially in the Amiga version. I think this is the first time Ocean used this sort of health bar for a licensed game, and we will be seeing it a couple more times. Well, here we are. The really big one of Ocean Software's biggest triumphs. It's time to have a look at the almighty Robocop, of which there are 4 particularly different versions on show here: Spectrum, C64, Amiga and Game Boy, although there will be a bit of Amstrad too. I can't really overestimate this game's success. It was the biggest title ever released on the Specky, for example, staying at number 1 for an eternity. And it wasn't even a licence that cost all that much. Gary Bracey, on one of his regular trips to Hollywood on the hunt for potential products, snagged Robocop at a very early stage for next to nothing. I mean, the film wasn't even projected to be a big hit at all. One wonders, in fact, how many other projects Gary also snagged at such a stage that we never saw anything of because the film never ended up coming out, or it flopped or whatever. Anyway, Robocop comes out and is a huge success, and Ocean simply has to slam dunk the game. And indeed, they do, on most formats anyway. The Spectrum game, as done by Mike Lamb, is a classic of Ocean's licensed game formula. For the most part, it's a very fine plain side-scrolling shooter where you simply take down thugs with the Auto 9, you've got a few neat power-ups including the ability to grab one of those big cannon guns at the end, and you'll have a couple of scraps with the Ed 209 as well. Great music too. You do have the legendary title screen music, of course, but the in-game music is also nice. And you get the obligatory little change-ups, a couple of hostage situations, and a little face matching minigame. The game is pretty damn good, and the amount of time I've spent with it over the years makes it one of my Specky favourites, a game that I have gone through many times. And hey, if you're an Amstrad owner, you're served pretty well too. The Amstrad is the same game, only with the addition of very nice colour and so on. Other than that, there's not too much difference, and it is still the same excellent game. Both of these games are great, and they remain firmly in the hearts of both Specky and CPC owners. The Commodore 64? Well, that's where things do get a little pear-shaped, for a rather infamous reason. It is, again, mostly the same. However, the difficulty has been upped massively seeing as you only have one life. And then the third level is just about impossible to complete due to a lack of time unless you glitch through a wall. And if you do that and reach the next side-scrolling level, you find a load of garbled graphics. Yes, the C64 version of the game was released despite being completely unfinished. Modern fixes do exist that sort out these slightly major issues, but the unfinished C64 Robocop is certainly one of the company's scummier moments, and generally I would just avoid this version completely as it is rubbish compared to the Specky and Amstrad. As for the Amiga, that's a slightly different kettle of fish. What you get here is a straight-up conversion of Data East's arcade game, which the other Robo games are similar to, but also differ from in quite a few ways. It's also a bad version of the game. It's quite slow and jerky, and ridiculously you only get one life. In an arcade game as ridiculously hard as this one? Sod off, Ocean. Again, I would skip this one completely. We do end on a good note though. The Game Boy game, which came out a couple of years later in 1990. This one's a lot more like the Specky and Amstrad with the odd little tweak here and there, a couple more enemies and different backgrounds and whatnot. You only get one life again, but you do get a lot of health and refills, and there are continues. You also have an excellent take on the original Jonathan Dunn soundtrack, complete with the title theme that ended up in an advert for Ariston. On the whole, this might actually be the definitive version of the game. I would still probably go with the Specky purely because of just how much time I've had with it, but the Game Boy version is very good indeed. Up next, we have a game that is, well, odd and bad. Ocean's take on Red Heat is a very slow-moving, auto-scrolling beat-em-up where the main amusement generally comes from the silly levels and sprites. I mean, the first level is set in a bathhouse where everyone's naked, you fight endless clones of John Rambo, and it all ends with what amounts to a snowball fight. Then the second has you shooting and punching hordes of evil nurses. It's also presented in a strange faux widescreen style and has interludes with James Belushi where he talks like a puppet, and so on. It would be more amusing if the game was good, but sadly it's a very lumbering beat 'em up that quickly gets exceptionally dull. One of the few really poor special effects games. It's amusing to watch in action, but pretty damn awful to actually play. It's not long, however, before we get to another big one. Mike Lamb continues to shine, going from Robocop straight into Batman the Movie, which has said kind of weird title to differentiate it from Ocean's earlier Bat-based game. This is another pretty big success for Ocean, selling very well indeed, much like just about every bit of merchandise that was associated with the movie, really. Looking at the 8-bit version first, you get another mix of styles. There's a couple of platform levels where you run about, chuck batarangs at goons, and use your grappling hook to get around. Seriously, I've played through Axis Chemical Plant so freaking much it's almost entirely embedded into my brain. These bits are very enjoyable. You also get a Batmobile stage where you use your grappling hook to turn around corners, a Batwind stage where you have to send the Smilex balloons into the sky, and a little bit where you work out the formula for Joker's gas that plays kind of like the old game Mastermind. On the whole, this is another excellent licensed game indeed, a terrific Batman tie-in that continues Ocean's rock-solid record with the Caped Crusader. As for the 16-bit version, seen here on the Amiga, it is largely the same. The two platform levels are, anyway. The Batmobile and Batwind levels are different though, taking place in a more traditional third-person view as opposed to the side-on view in the 8-bits. Now they obviously look nicer, but I find that they actually don't play nearly as well. They're pretty bloody frustrating, and turning in the Batmobile stage is especially a huge pain. Also, the music here isn't quite as good as it is in Matthew Cannon's original 8-bit rendition. Still, this was a big hit too, and also represents a big success for the Amiga in the UK. David Pleasance, Commodore UK's boss, put together the Batman pack with this game as the headliner in order to sell A500s, and it was a huge success. The inclusion of the Bat meant that the computer sold like proverbial hotcakes in 1989. Really, you can't say that this game is anything but a triumph for everyone involved. Here's one that I thought should be included for completion. WEC and Le Mans are licensors, after all. Anyway, WEC Le Mans is Ocean's port of Konami's original arcade. Mike Lamb is once again at the helm for this one, and it is a very good racing game. In fact, it's one of the best you'll find on the 8-bit micros, particularly on the Spectrum. It moves very smoothly for such a game on the system, and it's in full screen, which is something that even the almighty likes of Chase HQ can't claim. I believe that this was Mike Lamb's last work for Ocean, and it's a great way to go out. The only surprising thing about this game, perhaps, is that you can only find it on the 8-bits. WEC Le Mans never got a conversion to the Amiga or the Atari ST, although there were mentions of a 16-bit port being worked on at the time. Another movie? Another high-profile tie-in from Ocean. Particularly after the huge success of Robocop, Ocean absolutely went into overdrive when it came to licensed games, trying to get their hands on all sorts of movies. Here they've again gone for something more polished than the usual action movie fare. It's their game for the Untouchables. There's actually quite a few versions of this. We've got the 8-bit and 16-bit computer versions, a NES game, and a SNES game that was released later, although again they are all quite similar. We'll start with the 8-bit first, mostly on Specky. Again, it's what I know. This game really goes over the top with different gameplay styles. You've got a side-on platform stage to begin with, but it's actually the only one in the game. You go from there to rolling around and shooting liquor barrels, a cover shootout in the alleyways, a top-down run and gun on the steps where you kill goons and protect a baby, and a final shootout on the rooftop with Frank Nitti. The difficulty of just about every stage is brutal. This is a viciously hard game indeed, and you only get one life, although here at least you are actually able to continue from the level you died on. That is, if you even get past the first warehouse level. The actual gameplay is pretty good, even if the game could stand to be a bit more forgiving. The 1920s honky-tonk piano style music is perhaps a little grating, mind you. The C64 and Amstrad versions of this game are very similar in all areas, although the Amstrad game is weirdly very blue indeed as opposed to being colourful, which is kind of a disappointment. For the most part, however, the gameplay is the same, and so is the difficulty. For me, the 8-bit micro versions of this game are probably the best. The other versions can be a bit more variable. It feels like this should be a really decent game on the Amiga, but it is screwed up. The graphics are terrible, and some of the controls are quite annoying, like how you now vault on crates rather than just jump in. On the whole, nah. The NES version? Well, good lord. This changes things up a bit, starting with the street shootout as opposed to the warehouse, but this is by far the hardest version of the game. You get virtually no time on the shootout stages, and there are goons everywhere in the warehouse. Not good, really. The SNES version, however, is a bit of a smoother affair. Here you can actually pick and choose the assignments you want, and a good few things have been cleaned up. It's still a tough game, and no mistake, but not quite as vicious as it once was. On the whole, it's not bad at all on the SNES. So here's another strange one. This is Emilio Butragueno 2, another release that has an Ocean credit on it, but is mostly the work of Toposoft and released in Spain only. I suppose what you would expect here is another footy game much like the original, but this is different. It's actually two games in one. The first is a whole load of training exercises that, in practice, work similarly to a Daley Thompson type game, and then the second is a regular football game. In fact, what we have here is more like a mini compilation. Both of these games had already seen release in the UK. The training game is Gary Lineker's Super Skills, the football game is Gary Lineker's Hot Shot, and both were originally released by Gremlin. They're pretty much here as is, just with a Spanish translation. The Super Skills game is tedious, and the football game is fairly okay. And yeah, Ocean's name is on it, so here it is, for completion's sake. Everyone, say it with me. Ooh, Navy SEALs! Yes, it's another big blockbuster action movie game, and we've got a couple of different takes on Navy SEALs to show off here. The main one that came out is another very difficult game. You have to defuse all the bombs in a pretty strict time limit, and the terrorists naturally kill you with one shot. It really doesn't take long for all of your SEALs to say goodbye, although you might marvel at the various appalling portraits of Charlie Sheen, Michael Bain and so on. To be honest, this isn't a particularly good game regardless of format. It's just a really friggin' frustrating one that kind of forces you into endless trial and error and having to find an exact route through a stage just to avoid getting killed over and over again. Pretty dislikable on the whole. There is a much better game, mind you. The Game Boy Navy SEALs is a more obscure affair, but is totally different to all of the other releases. This is a more straightforward game that plays like a regular old action platformer, and not too bad of a one. There's also some cool enough music that plays in-game. It is still quite a hard game, seeing as there's one-hit deaths and a whole lot of nasty gotcha traps that will probably take you out way more than the enemies, but it's not quite as much of an irritating bastard as the more common Navy SEALs game. In the end, this one is perfectly a-okay. Naturally, when it came time for Robocop's sequel, Ocean was going to be there again for the big follow-up to the huge success that came before, and they certainly tried to push the boat out with Robocop 2. We have 6 noticeably different games here. A Speccy one, a C64 and NES one, an Amiga one, an Atari ST one, a Game Boy one, and the most interesting one that's quite possibly the killer app for a failed console. Starting with the Spectrum first, Robocop 2 takes a quite different route to the original. It's much more of a platformer, although obviously there's still plenty of enemies to kill. Robo feels so much slower and lumbering, which sucks both for dealing with enemies and trying to do all the jumping puzzles, especially when some paths in levels can just lead absolutely nowhere. The most annoying thing perhaps is enemies that come out of nowhere that you have to arrest, completely at random. It's very easy to just shoot these guys, and you'll lose a ton of health if you do. Naturally, you do get other things. There's shooting range stages, and a whole lot of brainstorm stages where you have to complete a quite challenging puzzle in order to fix Murphy's memory. The graphics aren't bad, but the lack of in-game music and the slower and way more frustrating gameplay make this a much worse game than the original. The C64 and NES game is a more straightforward platformer, but it can be a tricky one all the same. You have to collect as much nuke as possible while dealing with the perps, and oftentimes you'll have to go hunting for hidden areas in order to find enough nuke. If you don't get enough, you'll have to repeat the stage after going through some shooting range training. On the whole, this isn't particularly good. The worst thing is that Robocop actually has Mario-esque inertia when he moves, and that can really make the platforming frustrating. You also have a version of this game on the Game Boy which is slightly simplified, removing the shooting range parts, but generally much the same. Oh, and there's also sliding puzzles, because who the hell doesn't like sliding tile puzzles? I think this is the first time we've seen these, and it won't be the last. The Amiga one is more similar to the Spectrum game, but the stage layouts are pretty different. To the game's credit, it does at least control and present itself a lot better, and it's actually far better than what the Amiga got for the first movie, although I still wouldn't say it's any better than average. The Atari ST version? That's notably different, and I'd actually say it's better. It's even more like the Speccy game, but different in layout to both it and the Amiga title. Happily, it controls a lot better than both of those, and it's got excellent music too, courtesy of Matthew Cannon. Still a rather infuriating game to actually play, but we do get a little win for the ST here. It's nice when you have a game on here that's different to the Amiga one. And then we have the interesting one. Amstrad Robocop 2. And not just any Amstrad. This game originally came out for the Amstrad Plus and was then released on cartridge for the almighty Amstrad GX4000, where it's certainly one of the best games out of an admittedly limited bunch. This one's generally pretty different. It does follow the same layout as most of the other games with side-scrolling brainstorm puzzles and shooting ranges, but the main stages are completely different. Indeed, this is far more of a pure platformer, very little in the way of enemies, but lots of movement and jumping to do. Happily, the controls for this are far better than any other Robo 2 game, and good thing too, because this game is hard. A major platforming challenge indeed, but not one that's unfair as such. Generally it's challenging in the good way, and it is learnable. Really great music in this game too. It's much the same as the ST game's tunes, but they're still fantastic. I have to say I really do like this game a lot. It may well kill you a whole bunch, but it's got enough fun platforming and secrets about it while removing so much of the bullshit that plagues the other Robocop 2 games. A massive win for the Amstrad, and it's really a shame that this wasn't the main Robocop 2 game. After all, this game is rather obscure due to the platform it came out on. I would go as far as to say that this is one of my favourite Ocean licensed games. Oh boy. On the surface, Total Recall seems like an ordinary Ocean license. It's side-scrolling, it's got various bits, cool music, and generally it's okay. Far from the best game we've seen, but one I used to think was totally fine and still do, pretty much. But there's so much more to the story here, especially on the 8-bit micros. An utterly chaotic development, a wholly different game, and a madcap rush to create something salvageable out of the whole thing. Naturally, this game was supposed to be Ocean's big Christmas 1990 release, being an Arnie tie-in and all. Gary Bracey gave the project to another Manchester-based studio called Active Minds, and happily awaited results. A rolling demo of the Spectrum version even appeared in the Spanish Micro Hobby magazine, and it's, well, clearly incomplete, but the sprites do all move and everything, and surely that's enough to review the game, right? Yes, Micro Hobby did actually review the game based entirely on this demo, again one that you can't actually play, and gave it 75%. Games journalism, eh? It was a lot worse back then, believe me. Anyway, veteran ex-Ocean artist Simon Butler finds himself at Active Minds. He finds that the whole thing is a disaster. The game's a mess, most of the staff are smoking weed in the office rather than working on the game, and the managers are incompetent or even malicious. It's the worst thing since Highlander. It almost feels like sabotage because if, or more accurately when, this fails, Gary Bracey's head will be on the chopping block. Despite this, Gary's still convinced that all is going swimmingly, until his former employee comes into his office to tell him exactly what's going on. When Butler finally convinces Bracey of the horror that's unfolding mere minutes outside of Ocean's offices, the whole thing is scrapped and a new game is made in-house by a crack team of Ocean Dungeoneers, Butler, Andrew Dakin, Ivan Horn, Jonathan Dunn and so on, in literally 2 weeks for the Spectrum, Amstrad and C64. Somehow the game makes it out in time for Christmas. So really, even if the end product's only so-so, it's amazing that it was produced in such an incredibly short time. There is also an Amiga version of the game, by the way. Funnily enough, this one appears to be closer to what Active Minds were planning and, well, it's pretty terrible. The game made in a fortnight is a lot better. These days you can actually play the unfinished version on the Specky. The old rolling demo was hacked thanks to Mark R. Jones and an old pal of his named Adrian Sin, and you can experience the potential catastrophe for yourself. A big thanks to both Simon Butler and Mark Jones for providing all of us with the details on this one.
Hi, I'm Martin Shaw. This is Run the Gauntlet. If you want to see action sports, this is the place to be.
Who remembers Run the Gauntlet? An action-packed TV show from the late 80s where teams would take part in seriously intense events. They raced quad bikes, speedboats, motocross, all sorts of stuff like that. A big and busty show that was actually quite fun, if I remember correctly. Certainly decent fodder for a licensed game, and Ocean duly provided. This game isn't too bad, so long as you stick to the 16-bit or C64 versions where it just plays like a competently made top-down racing game, really. Maybe the C64's the best because it's got really crunchy and nice SID music. For heaven's sake, don't play this on the Specky version I had as a kid. That's also got decent AY music on the 128K, but a fast top-down racing game in flip screen? Yeah, that's not at all fun to play. But this is a perfectly decent game on the right formats. We move from one strange license right into another. Nightbreed is another one that Ocean went pretty heavy on, creating 2 entirely different games for Clive Barker's horror movie that would both be released on multiple platforms, an interactive movie adventure game and a simpler action title. In fact, they actually had licenses to create 3 separate Nightbreed games. The third one would have been more of an RPG, but this one never came out. This third game would have possibly been called Cabal, taking its name from Clive Barker's original book, and was worked on by Imagitech before ultimately being binned, with little evidence of it out there in the wild despite apparently being fairly well on the way at the time of cancellation. According to the good people at Games That Weren't, it's probable that the third Nightbreed game was ditched simply due to the movie itself being a bit of a flop. Anyway, both of the Nightbreed games are pretty lousy really. We've got both of them here on the Amiga. The action game is another one of those really annoying and confusing maze type games where your character is largely useless and you have to desperately try not to die before finding out where you actually have to go. Not a good one. The interactive movie isn't particularly good either, although it is at least a more interesting title that, at the least, could be thought of as a poor man's cinemaware game. You drive around to the various destinations, following the plot of the movie. The difficulty is vicious here too. You only get one life, and various random events are most likely going to ruin your day and get you chucked in the asylum for good before you even get close to doing anything of substance. While the film itself does certainly have its fans nowadays, these games aren't very well remembered at all, I'm afraid, and for good reason. Well, we're back to a more bog-standard footy game again. Adidas Championship Football. As far as footy games go, Ocean did at least release the exceptional matchday games, but that was quite some time ago, and a lot of their other football games are very much skippable, with this being no exception. It doesn't really even feel that much different from something like the old Emilio Butragueno game, and for frickin' 1990? This feels completely past it, to be honest. A very standard footy game attempting to cash in on the year's World Cup. However, even this game has some intriguing story behind it. This is actually one part of what was supposed to be a bigger game based around Liverpool FC. Said game would have also featured a management section to go along with the action. However, the Liverpool bit was scrapped because Grand Slam held a licence to make a game based on the club, and it was all a bit of a mess because they'd already binned their original attempt. In the end, Ocean ditched any attempt to sort it out, and the actual football game here was made virtually from scratch in a few weeks, which probably explains the poor quality, and Grand Slam did eventually release a Liverpool-based football game for computers. Who says that football games aren't interesting? We move on to 1991, and it's time for some wrestling. Naturally, Ocean was there to take advantage of the WWF gaining in popularity over here, and so we've got WWF Wrestlemania, a game that I was naturally all over back in the day, being a huge kid wrestling fan and so on. Yes, even though it's not very good. You get to play as either Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, or the British Bulldog, and you go through a roster of 5 unplayable heels: Mr. Perfect, the Warlord, the $1 Million Man, the Mountie, and finally Sergeant Slaughter. The general vibe here is of something that's a little bit like Technosa's arcade WWF games, but much simpler. You have very few moves and a lot of joystick breaking grapples. This is normally where I fall down, as you have to be so quick to react to the grapple in order to try and do your special move, and yeah, it doesn't usually happen. Probably the most fun part of the game is the promo exchange you can do before each match, which is at least a little unique. Nostalgia does kind of prevent me from totally crapping on this one, even if it is not that good, just because I did play it a lot, and admittedly thought it was awesome then. Shame the Specky version didn't come with a free video like the Amiga one, mind. Anyway, there is a much worse wrestling game to come. It's not long before we have another film licence that Ocean decided to put a lot of effort into, and this time around, it's Sam Raimi's Darkman. Again, we are spoilt for choice. I've picked out 4 separate Darkman games, and they range from being actually quite good to being an absolute shocker. Starting off with the 8-bit micros, the Specky Darkman is pretty much a typical side-scrolling beat-em-up, something that's in the Vigilante vein, although you do also get some platforming and chasing levels too. All told, it's not a bad game at all. I only wish it had some in-game music, especially because the title theme is another really good one. The C64 and Amstrad also get mostly the same game here, with only a few little differences. And of course the usual little minigame, this time a shooting gallery where the shooting is done with a camera and not a gun. It's a typical licensed game that's very much in the tried and tested Ocean formula, although not bad because of it. The Amiga Darkman game is also pretty similar to these ones, but it does expand a bit. This time the beat-em-up parts are a lot freer and more akin to Double Dragon, while the other parts happily remain. I actually quite enjoy this one, although I kind of wish that the graphics were a little less muted. The best Darkman game, however, is the one for the Game Boy. This gets rid of a lot of the fluff and is basically a straight beat-em-up, with the Double Dragon inspiration ratcheted up even further. For the Game Boy, it's actually a very good beat-em-up, and it's actually got music in the game. I would say that this one is worth playing. And then, well, you've got the NES game. Good lord. The angry video game nerd once said that Ocean was the UK equivalent to LJN, and I believe he said it as he was reviewing this game. Now I don't agree with the statement, but with this game I fully understand it, because it's utterly horrific. Hell, only the very worst of LJN's games beat this one out. This one goes the platformer route, and it is absolutely one of the most broken platform games I have ever seen. The controls are just balked beyond belief, with our hero skidding and bouncing about like he's in a frickin' pinball machine, and hitboxes that may as well not exist. This is a complete stinking turd, and honestly, it's one of the worst NES games I've ever played. We are starting to get to the end of the 8-bit Micro's involvement in this video, but as we do we find some odd little ones here and there, such as Ocean's name being on micro conversions of The Simpsons, Bart vs the Space Mutants. This game, originally by Acclaim, is not exactly well liked in its original form to begin with. And yet, even though I know it's kind of terrible, it still makes me very nostalgic because, again, I did have this version on the ZX Spectrum. The thought of playing this game on Specky does tend to surprise people, it has to be said. Anyway, most of what you'll find on the Mega Drive or NES or whatever is here too. Aliens that you have to jump on, exciting tasks such as spraying purple fins, simple little puzzling and very frustrating platforming. Pretty much everything from the console is here on Specky and Amstrad, and I suppose one other amusing thing is that this is a flick screen version of the game. I guess they couldn't be asked to bother with scrolling here at all, although I don't think it really affects this game all that much. The C64 version does have scrolling, although it's also the worst version. Quite a bit of stuff missing, and some things that feel quite lazy and unfinished. Oh yeah, and naturally you can play this on Amiga too, which feels a lot more like the console versions with music and what have you. A lot more effort clearly went into this version than the 8-bit ones, it has to be said, even if, in the end, it's still working from the same shoddy source material. Strictly speaking, in terms of port accuracy, it's pretty good. As a game, well, less so. There did eventually come a time when the typical Ocean licensed game formula started to wear a little bit thin, and that was certainly the case by the time Terminator 2 Judgment Day came out. What we've got here is a real disappointment. Here the formula consists of 3 separate and not very fun fistfights with the T-1000, a couple of top-down driving stages, and a couple of sliding puzzles. Mind you, the second level in the drains is so bloody ridiculous you'll be lucky to actually get past that one. Terminator 2 is absolutely wafer thin when it comes to any type of meaningful gameplay whatsoever, unfortunately. A total disappointment considering the movie that it's tied in with. Some more fun little things related to the C64 version. T2 was probably one of the last games really pushed with the system, seeing as there is a Commodore 64 computer release complete with lots of Terminator 2 advertising, including the funny quote, "I've returned," as opposed to "I'm back." presumably for copyright reasons. You could also get this game on cartridge too. The 64 always had a cartridge slot, but it was only really around now that you started to see a few cartridge games come out, perhaps as some desperate way to make it look more like a console. And speaking of which, yes, the cartridge does advertise itself as being playable on the utterly failed ultra-flop C64 game system. However, if you try and load it on there, you won't get far. Getting past the intro requires the use of a keyboard, which the 64GS obviously doesn't have. Absolutely sterling work by everyone involved. One of the odd and always fun things with licensed games is demonstrated here. We've just seen the high-profile, excellent and hit blockbuster get a thoroughly lousy game, and now we get to see the high-profile critical failure and box office flop get a really good one. Hudson Hawk's here, and special effects turning a hit on pretty much every system it came on. Everywhere I've played this, it's a rock-solid and fast-paced platformer, and in the context of this list, it's one of the best that's come out under the Ocean name in quite some time. You've got all sorts of nice creative touches, a bit of puzzling here and there, changing things a little bit now and again. It's what you want out of a nice platformer, and it's worth playing on everything, from the Amiga to the NES, all the way down to the ZX Spectrum. Perhaps this game points a bit more to Ocean ditching the whole loads of different minigames approach for their licensed titles. At least one hopes that it will. This for me is definitely a recommended game. Hook is another commercially disappointing movie that also received some decent games, although the best one by far was obviously Yokote's SNES game, which also got a good conversion from Core to the Mega Drive. That one is actually great. Ocean meanwhile handled Hook for the computers as well as the NES, and we have two totally different games because of that. The first, on the C64, NES and Game Boy, is another side-scrolling platformer, which is perhaps unfortunate because while it's certainly not terrible, I can't help but compare it to the 16-bit one that you should obviously play instead. This one here is fine, and it is mainly just about collecting a bunch of items and moving on. An old style of playing perhaps, but a simple and effective one. This game's definitely best played on the NES, by the way. It's not bad on the C64, but the loading times are horrendous. The game for computers such as the Amiga, ST and DOS is a totally different kettle of fish. This is a point-and-click adventure. Not the sort of game you'd usually associate with Ocean, it has to be said, and it's kind of easy to see why, I'm afraid. Hook just isn't a particularly interesting adventure. It tries to go for a bit of LucasArts vibe, but it lacks any of the great writing that you would see in such a game. Indeed, it's always a bit of a warning sign when so many of the background characters just say the exact same things. Now, I'm not an expert on point and clicks or anything like that, but I can kind of tell that this isn't a particularly worthwhile one, and you're definitely better off sticking to the more action-based title. Jeez, the bad movies are coming thick and fast. Yes, it's time to look at Ocean's games for the third Robocop movie. Again, we have multiple efforts here, and while most of them fall generally into the side-scrolling category, we have a very interesting one indeed for the big computers. One odd thing here is that these games came out over the course of a year, and they actually all predate the release of the Robocop 3 movie. In fact, the big game we're going to talk about actually came out in December 1991, over a year before the film was released. Anyway, starting off with the Spectrum and other 8-bit micros, Robocop 3 represents one of the last go-rounds for the old Ocean formula, fitting seeing as it's one of their last 8-bit micro games. The Specky version is very bare bones, just a handful of levels. You get a shooting gallery, a jetpack stage, and a couple of short side-scrolling levels largely consisting of fights with the Kanemitsu ninjas. It's generally not great, although one saving grace is that the music is absolutely incredible. Seriously, one of those games that's worth loading for the music alone. The music on the C64 version is even better, and the game does at least feel a little meatier here, I guess. Still pretty short on the whole. Alas, the game never came out on the Amstrad CPC. We saw our last CPC title in the video when we did Hudson Hawk. Moving on to consoles next, the NES version of Robocop 3 does actually retain the awesome theme music, which is one positive. The game itself ditches the shooting gallery type stages and mostly opts for straight ahead, ban average platforming. There's similarities here to what we saw in the Micros, and it does fly close to the C64 version, but just in general this is a wholly average title. The same kind of applies to the SNES game. This is naturally a much beefier affair, and it is different to the game we've seen already, with plenty more enemies flying about, but it is still very much in the mediocre camp, especially considering what we're about to see. This one also eventually came out on Mega Drive in late 1993, but that version came out through Flying Edge and doesn't have that much to do with Ocean. Unlike a lot of UK-based studios, Ocean were very much on the side of Nintendo through the 16-bit generation. And then, of course, we come to the big computer game, which is one of the most ambitious we've seen from Ocean to date. Robocop 3 was given over to developers Digital Image Design, or DID, a one-corn studio headed up by Martin Kenwright that specialised in 3D, particularly aircraft sims. As far as the movie went, they largely only had film stills and a vague idea of what the story was, but they still used this to create a 3D Robocop game, one that plays out as an early first-person shooter for the most part, along with a flying section in the jetpack, a small fighting section, and driving if you go for the game's cinematic mode. For 1991, this game is absolutely excellent, and it does make you feel quite a bit like Robocop. Even if the game hasn't necessarily aged brilliantly, it's still quite fun to play around with nowadays. And yes, it absolutely goes down as one of Ocean's very best licensed games. A pretty bloody great way to close out the story of Ocean and Robocop, in all honesty. Here's another little thing worth noting. The Amiga version of the game was packed in with a little dongle that you had to plug into the second joystick port in order to play the game, something that Ocean boasted would knock pirates for 6, making the game uncrackable. Of course, they were wrong, and Robocop 3 was fully cracked and on the bulletin boards in a matter of hours after its release in December 91. If you want to know more of the details here, the almighty Modern Vintage Gamer has a great video deep dive all about the cracking of Robocop 3, which I recommend that you seek out. We've got a nice little run of generally good games going here, as it turns out. Up next is The Addams Family, another big film, and another one with a whole variety of games. We've got about 4 different ones here, in fact. The big one here is, of course, the one that came out on both the SNES and the Mega Drive. You play as Gomez, as you do in all of these games, and you have to hunt through the house and its grounds to find your missing family members. It's a Euro platformer through and through, but a very good one. The controls are super responsive, the level design is fun, and there's plenty of cool secrets to be found as well if you're willing to go around looking for hidden doors and the like. Suddenly, Ocean's platforming game really appears to have gotten quite strong. This is one of the best ones that they ever released, and it's not for nothing that it usually finds itself on lists of good licensed games from the 90s. A recommended title for sure. It is probably also worth mentioning that of all the licensed games that Ocean worked on over the years, and they did work on a lot, Gary Bracey considers The Addams Family to be his personal favourite from the company. As for the other Nintendo platforms, those are a little different. The NES game still has much the same aim, but the layout here has changed. I think it's a bit more similar to the 8-bit micro games that we're going to see in a little bit. Graphically it's quite nice and colourful, but I don't think the game's nearly as good as the 16-bit one. Pretty average. The Game Boy game, however, is a considerably better prospect. I really like this one a lot. This is a more linear platformer that tends to go for straight ahead levels, and it's a very good one for the handheld. I quite enjoyed this and spent a good amount of time with it, and I would recommend this one too. Finally, you've got the 8-bit micros, which are okay, I suppose. Again, they're both very colourful. I feel that the Specky one in particular might be one of the best looking games of the computer's commercial period, although as platformers they are again pretty average and more like the NES version, despite being flip screen. Yes, even the C64 version here is flip screen. This game marks the last time that we see the ZX Spectrum in this video, although there are still a couple more C64 versions of games for us to look at. I said when doing WWF Wrestlemania that an even worse wrestling game was on the way. And here it is. In fact, WWF European Rampage Tour is one of the worst ones I've ever seen. Just a complete disaster, and not even a natural one. Just about everything here is worse, although the amount of playable wrestlers does jump up to 4. There's no Bulldog, but you can play as either Hogan, Warrior, Randy Savage or Bret Hart. On the Amiga, the focus is on tag team wrestling. You pick 2 guys and then you fight the Nasty Boys, the Natural Disasters and Money Inc. in several different arenas. You have to fight these teams 3 times before facing the Legion of Doom. On the C64, it's only singles matches, and in my opinion, European Rampage features the worst lineup of opposing wrestlers in wrestling game history. They actually managed to pick the crappiest member of each team to fight against. You go against Typhoon, Jerry Sags and IRS before fighting Animal. Unbelievable. That and the gameplay is even more simplistic than what was in WrestleMania, and if you're a wrestling fan, well, so many things here are hilariously silly looking, from the backbreakers to pinning people while they're laying on their stomach. It's incompetent beyond belief, although it can certainly be rather funny. Still, one of the worst wrestling games there has ever been, without a doubt. Happily, we can move on to something largely better here. Lethal Weapon is one of those licensed games that's supposed to be for the whole series of films, although it did coincide with the release of the 3rd one. One odd thing is that the license here seems to be split between 2 companies, with Eurocom handling the NES and Game Boy games and producing a rather terrible beat-em-up. Happily, Ocean do a lot better, especially on the Amiga, where Lethal Weapon might possibly be the best platformer they've released to date. I'm not joking, this is an absolute gem that even has the look of a classic platformer, despite featuring a hard-nosed pair of cops like Riggs and Murtaugh. It moves with a great deal of fluidity, has levels that are chock full of things to do, and Ocean actually managed to strike the right balance with the difficulty, which, let's face it, they don't often do. The Amiga Lethal Weapon is a game that's highly recommended, as it shines in just about every department going, from the general play of the whole thing to the ridiculously catchy Barry Leach soundtrack. And the really freaking annoying thing is that while this should have been an easy slam dunk conversion to consoles, Ocean managed to completely screw the game up on the SNES. I don't really know what happened here. The game superficially looks the same, but the controls are somehow a hell of a lot worse, it's completely frustrating, the great music isn't there anymore, and the game doesn't even look as good. How on earth do you manage to take such a good game and mess it up like this? God damn it, Ocean. There is one other curious version though. Lethal Weapon got a C64 game too, which surely must be one of their very last titles on the computer. It's another platformer, although the layouts are different here. Less of a good game and more of a curiosity, if I'm honest. It's just a bit of a surprise that this one exists at all. I suppose I should also mention the unreleased lethal weapon for the Master System. This was in development by Probe, and honestly it's unclear whether this would have been released by Ocean or Eurocom, especially seeing as all that exists is a bit of music from the legendary Jerome Tell. With Probe developing, I would lean heavily towards this being an Ocean project, so it's here for completion's sake. Here is one of the more obscure Ocean licenses, one for the old 90s cartoon series The Legend of Prince Valiant, which you may possibly remember. I certainly do, as it was quite popular in Europe, and seemingly less so in its country of origin, seeing as these games never saw release in America under the Prince Valiant name. In fact, the NES game here didn't even see American shores at all. It's a PAL-only game, although Pico did release a version of it in America a couple of years ago that was called Little Lancelot. The game itself is a pretty average side-scroller of sorts, one of those annoying ones you often get on the NES where your character is kind of useless and only seems like he's able to throw rocks, as if it's a medieval Friday the 13th or something. To be fair, this game isn't nearly as bad as that one, but it is still another game that goes into the rather large pile of mediocre Ocean licenses. The Game Boy game, however, is a much more interesting title. What we have here is a mix of action and strategy where you move your units around the map and can switch between them in a turn-based style, but the actual fighting takes place in a traditional top-down action style where you play it out yourself as opposed to watching the result. Naturally, there's a variety of units with different skills and so on, all the things you would expect from a strategy title, just with a neat little twist. It goes without saying that this is a much better and more interesting game than the NES title, and it actually did get an American release of sorts. It came out through Electrobrain without the license, going by the name of Kingdom Crusade. Ignore the NES game, and obviously go and play this one. Once again, Ocean has gone all out on a licence for a film that, alas, has ended up disappointing at the box office. That's certainly the case for Cool World, seeing as it's another total flop and hardly worthy of the 4 different games that Ocean created for it. Mind you, these games are pretty much flops too this time around, I'm afraid to say. The SNES Cool World, for a start, is just beyond frickin' annoying. It's this side-scrolling adventure platformer of sorts filled with joyful insta-death traps that you can barely avoid, irritatingly cryptic puzzles, and a general sense throughout of I do not know what to do, and quite frankly I don't really give a toss, that pervades over everything before the game eventually gets shut off. Absolute gash, quite frankly. The other games don't fare a whole lot better. The NES one is kind of similar in its mixture of action and puzzles, and not exactly all that fun, but it is a fair deal better designed. Doesn't stop it being quite boring though. And yeah, the Amiga's the same deal once more. This one does actually feature a bit more platforming, which is at least a bit more entertaining than the aimless walking around that tends to be the feature of the other versions. And there's even a C64 version of the game too. This is more likely Amiga version, although cut down a bit to represent the freakier parts of the movie. Being more of a straight platformer, it's probably the best one in all honesty, which isn't saying a lot. Also, it's the last Commodore 64 game in this video, and the last 8-bit micro game full stop. The end of an era, in many ways. Not exactly going out in a blaze of glory, but it had to end sometime. Back we go then to the Addams Family. We got fine results the first time out, and everyone's favourite creepy and kooky bunch are back again for Pugsley's scavenger hunt. Naturally, it's the boy of the family who takes the lead, and the style here is more in line with the Addams Family cartoon than the movie. There are 2 games to be found here, although we have kind of seen one of them before. The NES version of Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt is actually a conversion of the 16-bit Addams Family game that was on SNES, Mega Drive and Amiga and so on, only with Pugsley in the lead role rather than Gomez. Not a bad conversion, although naturally better with Gomez in the lead. The SNES game is the new one here then, and it does follow in much the same style as the first, with Pugsley going around the house and rescuing everyone. The finished platformer is, yeah, it's pretty much just okay. While it's still much the same type of play, and it does look very nice, I feel that Ocean pulled it off much better in the original Addams Family than they do in this game, which kind of feels a bit more generic in many ways. Maybe it's just because Pugsley is a little dickhead while Gomez is a glorious style icon. I don't know. It's still not a bad game or anything like that, mind you. There's just not a huge amount to say here, really. Moving away from the endless parade of movie and TV licenses and so on, here we have the first of two puzzle games that Ocean made that have a license for the character of Colin Curley, the mascot for Quaver's Crisps. This first one, Pushover, actually doesn't have you play as the forever insatiable dog. Instead you play as someone named G.I. Ant, and you have to rescue Colin's crisps because he's lost them down a giant anthill. Strictly speaking, the Quaver's sponsorship is only on the Amiga version. It's missing from the game's port to the SNES. On either platform the game is okay. You have to move these blocks around in such a way that they'll all fall down, domino style, when you push them. It gets challenging pretty quickly, mainly due to the time being pretty tight and the controls being rather slow. It's fine, but there's a much better game with a similar concept coming fairly soonish. But not before we get to another very big license indeed. Yes, it is time for Jurassic Park. Ocean did manage to get their hands on this massive license, at least for Nintendo consoles and the Amiga, and they're going to pull out all the stops for it. Jurassic Park, mind you, is a sign of how things have changed for Ocean Software when it came to grabbing these tie-ins. The days of Gary Bracey nipping over to Los Angeles and grabbing licenses on the cheap are largely gone, with the process now requiring a lot more negotiation and a lot more in the way of cash. Film companies are much more aware of the power that these games can have, after all. Hell, they've been getting more and more clued into it ever since the absolute juggernaut that was Batman. So these licenses are certainly proving to be a lot more expensive to grab. In the heyday of Ocean's tie-ins in the 80s, a licence usually cost them tens of thousands of pounds. In the case of Jurassic Park right here, it cost them $3 million. And more than that, the film companies naturally want to exercise a bit more control over them. That's certainly the case here with Steven Spielberg, a pretty avid gamer himself, who doesn't want these games to just be any old gubbins. He wanted a game that was, in his words, groundbreaking. Naturally, that means the cost of making these games is going to go up too, by quite a lot. Ocean always tended to prefer being left to their own devices with these licenses, of course. They never made an attempt to grab a Disney movie license, for example, because Disney licenses were always incredibly expensive and they were very protective. The trouble that they're finding as we get further into the 1990s, even though they'd had a lot of success with licenses, was that more companies were becoming more like Disney. Anyway, the big Ocean Jurassic Park game is the one for the SNES, and they do try and do things a bit differently. It's a top-down game where you play as Dr. Grant and try to make your way through the park, all the while collecting eggs, communicating with others, hunting for keycards, and doing various other things connected to the movie, naturally avoiding or engaging with dinosaurs throughout. Most of the game is top-down when you're outside, but when you're inside a building, the game switches to a first-person shooter mode, certainly one of the earlier examples of something like this on a console. Generally speaking, I like the game despite its faults. Yes, said first-person sections are quite slow and come with a tiny display, and the top-down sections can be rather annoying too. It's an easy game to get lost in. Again, I suppose nostalgia has a lot to do with this one. I quite like the game's atmospherics, with lots of sound and more cinematic music cues. It certainly tries to do some interesting things, even if it may well fail at them in the end. And it certainly did sell well at least. Ocean weren't necessarily happy with what they did here, but it was a hit. Whether that was enough to recoup the costs of securing the license and making the game is another matter, I suppose. The Amiga Jurassic Park is also pretty high on the production values. Again, it's a mix of 2D top-down sections and 3D first-person parts, although this game features levels as opposed to being a big open adventure. This is some pretty high-level stuff for the Amiga. The first-person parts actually might be more impressive than the ones on the SNES, although you can't see that far in front of you. Some great music too, from the excellent Dean Evans. It is, again, another game that is quite easy to get a little bit lost in, and the gameplay could perhaps be kinda lacking, but it's still hard to question the amount of effort that clearly went into the title. It's certainly not a lazy production by any means. And finally, we've got the NES and Game Boy games. These ones are more simplified, naturally sticking purely to top-down gameplay. And once again, these aren't bad at all. Hell, they might be a tighter experience than the bigger budget 16-bit titles, seeing as they largely stick to one form of gameplay only. Again, we've got some really cool music, and the graphics certainly do seem to be pushing the old NES quite a lot. Not bad for a very late title on the system. Indeed, this is the last NES game that we're going to see in the video, although we certainly do have a couple more Game Boy games to come. Generally speaking, the Ocean Jurassic Park games are pretty decent in many different areas, and really they would have to be pretty high up on the list of Ocean's tie-ins. This is another one that kind of feels a little borderline, but seeing as International Open Golf Championship does feature a sponsorship from the high-class knitwear fashion brand Pringle of Scotland no less, I've included it. Not that there's much to see here. This is a very lousy golf game. It is a very slow golf game, even on the Amiga. Everything just seems to take ages, and it very annoyingly uses a picture-based menu, something that is often one of my pet hates. Really very little to say about this one, quite frankly. Obviously you should just stick to EA's PGA Tour golf games or something along those lines. Ugh, we're back to the terrible films and games of the films once again. Dennis Le Menace, or simply Dennis depending on where you're playing it, is absolutely hideous. Whether you're playing it on the SNES or especially on the Amiga, what you'll find here is one of the most insultingly generic, aimless and pathetic excuses for a platform game that ever came out in the 16-bit era. Seriously, this is Ocean's worst game for quite a while. It hardly helps that it comes from such an abominable film, but my god, the game's bad enough without the license being so terrible. I don't know, it does feel like, short of pain through the nose for an obvious winning license like Jurassic Park, Ocean had perhaps lost their knack a little for picking out some actual decent licenses to make games from. That certainly seems to be the case when it comes to this wretched game anyway. How about some more sports? Actually, once again, a traditional sports game license feels like a bit of a break from Ocean's usual movie licenses, a palate cleanser of sorts, and this one's a game that was only released in Germany to boot. It's Lothar Matthäus, the interactive football simulation, and naturally it's a football game that takes a license from the legendary German midfielder and national captain. And actually it's quite a decent footy game. It's kind of in the old kick-off style, but it does play an aggressive game of football that actually feels quite fluid, a lot of it based on one-touch passing, and normally there's plenty of goals as a result. There's a different sort of mechanic to the passing that makes it easier to pin actual balls up the field, as opposed to just booting it aimlessly in the classic Sam Allardyce manner. Pretty good, if you like this sort of thing. Ocean's name is on an anime license? Well, there's a turn up for the books. But here's Ranma and a Half, Hard Battle for the SNES. Ocean, as you might have guessed, didn't develop this one, merely publishing it in Europe. The game was originally released in Japan by Messiah. As to why this game came out in the West while so many other anime games did not, from my understanding Ranma was one of the first anime shows to really gain some considerable popularity in the West, which most likely explains it. I'm sure there are people who can expand upon that. As befits the show, the characters here are pretty kooky indeed, what with frustrated parents who just happen to be pandas and so on, and you even get a bit of a storyline to go with the fights. It's just a shame that the fights themselves are lacking. The whole thing plays out like a bog standard Street Fighter clone, and not a good one at all. It's a shame really, but this is just one of many average one-on-one fighters from the time, so it's not too surprising.
I'm a good kid!
Now here is a really excellent one. One Step Beyond is the second puzzle game to feature the almighty Colin Curley, and in this one you get to play as the dog himself when he's sucked into his computer whilst eating his favourite gigantic quavers. The premise here is a bit similar to Pushover, only this game's based around jumping. You have to jump on all the tiles in a sequence, closing them up and leaving the quaver's exit tile until last. Whereas Pushover was intriguing, if not great, this one just works. It's very addictive indeed, and a whole lot of fun to figure out the sequence you've got to go in. Naturally there's lots of different sorts of tiles, and a pretty strict set of rules you have to follow, but the game's quite forgiving and you can just keep on having a go as much as you want without being pressured by a silly lives counter or anything like that. Excellent music from Dean Evans too, that really seals the deal on this one. It's a puzzle game that I massively enjoy, and one of the Ocean licensed games that I would recommend the most. Absolutely worth a play. Right now. Who's ready for some more golf games? I know I certainly am. Ryder Cup Johnny Walker is another game from the same people who made the rather poor International Golf Open Championship, and it's slightly better, I guess. It moves a bit faster at least, but it does still have a fair few of the first game's problems. In the main, it all just feels kind of lifeless, with basically not even the faintest hint of sound or anything at all. There's a fine line between a golf game being relaxing and being boring, and this falls firmly into the latter camp. Again, just go and play a PGA Tour game if you want something like this. Happily, Ocean does have you covered a bit when it comes to PGA Tour games, at least on the Amiga, where they handled a conversion of EA's PGA European Tour. Now if you're not really into such games you may wonder just what on earth the difference is here between this and the last one, but seriously, it's night and day. It's all so much smoother in every department, you actually have a bit of ambience, and it's generally just nice to spend a little bit of time with. Relaxing, chilled out, stress-free gaming. That's what a good golf game should be, and that's what you get from the classic PGA Tour golf games. Ocean did this one a bit of justice. It's exactly what it should be. Oh dear. Yes, we've got another total crap fest right here. Eek the Cat is a game for the SNES based on the cartoon, and, well, people don't necessarily talk about this one as one of the worst games for the system, but seriously, it's right down there. This is, in many ways, a completely botched reskin of a probably more famous original Amiga game called Sleepwalker. That one's not particularly hot either, but it's certainly better than this. As in Sleepwalker, your job is to clear a path for some dazed person to get through a level. The whole process is frustrating at every step, and most people probably wouldn't bother to even get past the first level with the old lady. Also, the game is really dark for some reason. This seems to happen in a couple of games here and there, and when it does, well, you kind of know you're in for something terrible. A horrid game indeed. Speaking of horrid games, Ocean has a credit on the Amiga version of Shaq Fu, presumably only for publishing. Obviously this game is mainly the fault of Delphine Software. Undoubtedly you all know a lot about Shaq Fu already, and make no mistake, it's certainly not any better on the Amiga. As much as it's often cited as one of the worst games ever made, I don't necessarily agree with that. The plot is so ridiculous that it's actually kind of amusing to go through, and the fighting action is, well, it's just a little lousy in the main. I've played a hell of a lot worse, that's for sure. I mean, I'd rather play 5 hours of Shaq Fu than 5 minutes of Slaughter Sport on the Mega Drive. Ocean don't have a big part in this one, but it's here for completion's sake. However, I can most certainly put the full blame on Ocean for another hideous abomination along the lines of The Adventures of Mighty Max, which again is another game that should be right down there with the very worst of the whole 16-bit era. This platformer is absolutely broken beyond belief. Our annoying little prick of a hero is useless beyond description, with an attack that barely hits anything and has little effect when it does, and movement that is just about uncontrollable. The frickin' jumping, I mean, my god! The camera moves around like crazy whenever you do anything, to the point where this game actually starts to make me feel a little queasy before too long, and I don't suffer from motion sickness. This is one of Ocean's worst ever games, and I sincerely hope that I never have to play this godforsaken hell pit of a game for any purpose ever again. I loathe it. Oh dear me, the quality has really fallen off a cliff, hasn't it? We've now got a tie-in for the live-action Flintstones movie. Bad things are most certainly expected, although, actually, this is a lot better than the games that we've just seen. It's a perfectly okay platformer. We're back to the level of presentation we might usually expect from Ocean, with the graphics and the music being pretty good. There's a few different things to do in the stages, at least, although the difficulty can go a little up and down rather than being all neat and ordered. I would probably rather play this game on the Game Boy than the SNES, where you do get a nice and simple platformer that avoids a bit of the bullshit that you can sometimes get with the 16-bit game. There are better Flintstones games out there from the likes of Taito, but I would say that this one's not too bad on the whole. This game was also supposed to come out for the Mega Drive, but for whatever reason it never got a full release. It did however make an appearance on the Sega Channel in 1995. Prototypes of this version are out there, but the full game has never been dumped. We are actually starting to get quite close to the finishing line here. We're nearing the end of the 16-bit years, and Ocean didn't release many licenses at all in the 32-bit generation before getting swallowed up by Infogrames. We do have more games that I don't think Ocean did too much with beyond publishing. For example, they briefly worked with Electronic Arts to publish a handful of sports games on the SNES in Europe, so what you're seeing here are the SNES versions of the original FIFA, Madden 95 and NBA Live 95. As you might expect from this era of EA Sports, all of these games are very half-decent indeed, thoroughly acceptable 16-bit sports by any standard. That said, I think that in this era, EA's sports games were really at home on the Mega Drive. These games are fine, but they're not as good as their equivalents on Sega's system. Hell, EA and Sega in general just seem to go hand in hand during this era, which might possibly be why you get roundabout situations like this with Ocean getting involved on other platforms. This game here is a bit more major. Ocean's original sequel to Jurassic Park for Nintendo platforms. Jurassic Park 2 The Chaos Continues is a more straight-ahead platformer for the SNES and, yeah, it doesn't deviate much from the, at best, average games that Ocean has been releasing lately. One quite memorable thing here is that you do get a big animated intro with a lot of full speech, something that you didn't normally see on the system, so I guess that's something. But on the whole, this is just a bit of an unmemorable action game. Looks and sounds okay, but the play doesn't match up to the presentation. The original Jurassic Park game may have had its flaws, but it did at least have more ambition. However, the Game Boy version of the game, well, that's a lot better. This is very different. You play as Dr. Grant once again, and you have to find key cards in order to open the gate at the end of each level. The play here is better in every way. Very nice controls, lots more enemies to kill and what have you. It got criticised at the time for being a little easy, but seeing as Ocean's games can often gravitate to being irritatingly unfair, I don't mind something that's a bit more easygoing. Honestly, this is actually a very nice platformer. Ocean did produce quite a lot of good stuff for the Game Boy, in my opinion. They almost feel more at home there than they do on the Super Nintendo. Here's another football tie-in game. Manchester United Championship Soccer, from the time when the Red Devils were in everything. You know, days that seem like a long-distant memory for fans of the team now. This is the last in a series of Man United games that were developed by Chrysalis, but while they self-published the other ones, this one had Ocean's hands on it. It's actually easily the best of these games. It is a fair bit of a sensible soccer rip-off, playing at a similarly fast speed and even coming with a view that's an awful lot like Sensi to go along with an isometric view, but the football itself is just fine, and definitely better than the earlier Man United games which were wonky at best. In Germany, this one came out as the second Lothar Matthäus game, and it's probably not quite as interesting as the first one. Still, it's a fairly entertaining game of football. Another very tenuous one, once again. We've got a couple of Codemasters games that Ocean published on the SNES, specifically Micro Machines 1 and 2. Again, these titles are pretty famous and Ocean only has a slight involvement. These games were justifiably very popular, fast and furious top-down racers that really shine when you get some multiplayer going, but are still a good laugh if you're just playing on your own against the computer, and there's a whole bunch of characters for you to play as or race against, including Bad Influencer's Violet Berlin. They're not exactly full-on Ocean software games, but they're here for completion, and they are pretty damn great. Here's another one that Ocean have their name on, although again I'm not sure how involved they were, seeing as it's a football management sim that's entirely in German, with no English translation to speak of, at least not on the Amiga. Bundesliga manager Hat-Trick seems, well, it seems like most any other footy manny game, of which there were a lot of at the time, although naturally these games do feature a lot of text, and that's kind of lost on me seeing as I don't really know German. As such, there isn't exactly a whole lot I can say about this. I'm kind of surprised that this didn't get some English version like On the Ball did, seeing as football management games were all the rage on the Amiga back then. Speaking of the Amiga, this is the final time we'll be seeing the computer in this video, which is another sure sign that we're getting close to the end. Well, this is the last really big tie-in for a movie that Ocean did in the time before Infogrames bought them. And again, they didn't exactly pick well. Being that the movie was supposed to be massive, cost a gargantuan amount of money to make, and then ended up being one of the biggest flops of all time, I dread to think how much cash Ocean had to splash out to get the Waterworld license, but I can't imagine that it was at all worth it. Still, you'd hardly want another studio working on a game for Waterworld, would you? Dad jokes aside, we have 3 different Waterworld games, including a game that's released on one of gaming's biggest flop machines, which is, well, there's kind of something poetic about that, isn't there? The funny thing about the Waterworld game, at least on the SNES, is that in many ways it's not half bad, certainly better than the film in any case. The game features several different parts. In the main bit, you drive your boat around and perform various tasks that naturally pit you up against the smokers, and usually have you saving survivors or helping them into their base. The second part is the diving section, which is actually quite cool. You swim and you collect treasure from the deep. I guess the main great part of this, as with a lot of the game, is the music. Seriously, Dean Evans composed an absolutely wonderful soundtrack for Waterworld that is, quite honestly, one of the best in any ocean game. And that's saying something, seeing as a lot of ocean games have really good music. The third part is a regular action platform stage, and it's the weakest by far. The controls are a bit ropey on this one, and Kevin Costner is pretty bloody ineffective. Hunting around for smokers to kill can be annoying. In any case, the Waterworld game perhaps isn't as bad as you think it might be. The Game Boy game is more of a straight-ahead title, as you might expect, although a lot of it is based around diving with some platform bits snuck in. It is one of their weaker Game Boy titles, I have to say. I mean, it might be cool if you're someone who really likes swimming levels, I suppose. I'm sure such people exist. But what makes for a cool short interlude in the SNES game doesn't exactly make for a great full game, especially when the music isn't half as good. And then, of course, yep, we've got Waterworld on the Virtual Boy. This is a pretty simple game. It's basically just score attack, killing boats and sharks and what have you in each wave and keeping survivors alive as they thrash about in the water. This continues until you die, with no ending, so there's not all that much to it really. It's worth pointing out again that the music is very good, at least. Obviously this isn't some sort of killer app that makes a Virtual Boy worthwhile or anything, but it is kind of an amusing thing to see. It should be noted that there were supposed to be a lot more versions of Waterworld for other platforms, but beyond the PC game released years later, nothing to do with Ocean, a lot of them ended up getting cancelled. The Mega Drive, PlayStation, Saturn, 3DO and Jaguar games were never released. There is a prototype Mega Drive version of the SNES game by Ocean that's actually fairly well complete, but didn't get published. My guess is that it was simply cancelled after the film bombed so hard. Ocean did work on the Saturn version of the game, and that would have been a textured 3D and possibly fuller version of the game that we eventually saw on Virtual Boy, apparently featuring a dynamic Ocean, whatever that means. Incredibly little is known about the Jaguar game other than that this was Ocean 2. Who knows whether it was similar to the proposed Saturn game, or if it was something else. My guess is the former. As for the 3DO and PS1, that wasn't Ocean. That game would have been made by Software Creations, published by Interplay, and it would have been a rail shooter in a similar vein to the earlier Star Wars Rebel Assault games. That was the inspiration, apparently. But, like many others, it didn't make it to dry land. In closing, it turns out that huge flop movies have the potential to result in tons of cancelled games. So, here's our last released 16-bit game from Ocean, and it is actually a pretty good one to go out on. Addams Family Values takes a completely different direction from the other games in the series, opting instead for a top-down adventure sort of game with some RPG elements. You play as Uncle Fester, and you have to find your way to rescue Pubert, the newest member of the family who's been kidnapped. And yeah, the game's just fine. It plays nicely for being one of these games in something of a Zelda style, albeit a bit more simplified, with cool graphics to boot. You can play this one for either the SNES or the Mega Drive, and it's a pretty cool way for Ocean to finish up business with the 16-bit consoles. I would recommend this one as a worthy little game, as I would with most of the other Addams Family games that Ocean released. Here's a little extra bonus, mind you, that didn't get released. Ocean did make a game based on Le Shadow, yet another huge flop of a film. Geez, they really did start to develop some reverse Midas touch deal when it came to picking licenses, didn't they? In fact, in this instance, the Shadow movie was so much of a flop that Ocean decided not to put the game out for that reason, although it was virtually finished, and the game has been dumped for a long time, being leaked by a scene group simply called Fuck in March of 1995. Anyway, the game itself is a beat-em-up on the SNES, a fair bit like Konami's Batman Returns, I suppose. It's actually not too terrible, really. Not exactly a memorable game, but it would probably keep you entertained for a few minutes if you like a bit of the old arcade beat-em-up style. Still, I can't imagine this doing well considering what happened to the movie, so releasing it was presumably more trouble than it was worth. The game was set for release months after the film, and purported franchise fell flat, and with the company's finances starting to get quite shaky in the mid-90s, I wonder if it's a case of Ocean simply not being able to afford the costs of duplicating, distributing and promoting a cartridge that was so likely to be a big commercial failure. This begs the question, of course, are there any other unreleased licensed games lurking about in the Ocean archive? There's been a few that have been covered already, such as the Liverpool game, or the first Total Recall, and the whole Waterworld debacle, as well as some ports that didn't make it. As it turns out, there are a good few others kicking about. A playable beta does exist for a fighting game based on the DC Comics character Lobo, and the game was even reviewed by a couple of mags, but it never materialised. Sticking with DC, Ocean worked on a tie-in game for the Green Lantern that would have been a more typical platformer. This one was heavily previewed in some mags at the time, but ultimately got cancelled after both a long and tortured development, and DC demanding all sorts of changes to the game to the point where Ocean simply decided to cut their losses. A prototype ROM of this game has been dumped, but to date it has not been released. There's also Batman The Adventure, a text adventure from Canvas using the same engine that powered the Neverending Story that, unfortunately, has never been found, and with the early and tragic death of author Ian Weatherburn in 1990, it is unlikely to ever be found. I suppose that there is also, of course, the first version of World Cup Carnival that Ocean was supposed to be working on for US Gold, and that US Gold hoped would be along the lines of their matchday games. In this instance, it appears that Ocean basically didn't do a damn thing here, leaving US Gold somewhat in the lurch. We have quite a few other unreleased games for which there exists little but mentions here and there in the gaming press. There's a slight mention of Ocean working on a game for the film Winds of Apache, and it's possible that whatever work had been done on this was turned into Navy SEALs. Speaking of flop movies, there was also word of Ocean working on a game for the film Radio Flyer. This again seems to have dropped when the movie itself bombed. One of the more intriguing unreleased games is Zoiks, a point-and-click game that was worked on while Ocean was with Infogrames that would have featured a cast of Hanna-Barbera cartoon characters. The game was announced and promoted, but it never saw the light of day. Another early one was Airwolf. Ocean were working on a game for this TV series pretty early on, but they'd only made a handshake agreement with the licence holders. On finding this out, Elite Systems swept in, took the licence from under their noses, and after winning a legal argument over it, proceeded to release their infamous, monstrously difficult Airwolf game that you're seeing here. Finally, there's licenses that Ocean tried to get, but couldn't. Generally they got most of what they went for, but they couldn't quite land one for Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, as it was over here, despite having a solid relationship with Konami that they hoped would give them first dibs on converting their highly successful Turtles games. However, Mirrorsoft managed to get in ahead of them, releasing conversions of Konami's TMHT games through their Imageworks label, with their arcade conversion coming out just before the company's total implosion following the death of Robert Maxwell and revealing of his fraudulence. So yeah, there is a fair bit of intrigue dotted around in the archives, and hopefully a lot of stuff that's yet to be found and released. Now though, it's time to look at the final 3 games in this video. The first 2 games in this last trio are pretty minor, but one of them is at least amusingly weird. Ocean handled the distribution for a PC point-and-click adventure called Animal, which appears to be the only game by a very obscure studio called Microtime. The animal in question? That's the Pepper Army animal, the rather shouty mascot for the aforementioned snack, as voiced by Ade Edmondson. So yeah, quite an odd one. Good game though? Not really. It's quite an irritating point-and-click where the only real thing of interest is Ade Edmondson, and everything else is quite ugly. Shame really. I thought this might be a little bit of fun, but I just couldn't get anywhere at all with it, and it doesn't appear to have reviewed well either. Just a curiosity, really.
Breaking. Another sad victim of political biscuit breaking.
So much custard!
Next, we have a game for the PS1 that Ocean released in Europe as Total Driving, but Activision released in the US as Car and Driver Presents Grand Tour Race in '98, taking a license from the Motor magazine. Technically this one doesn't really belong, but I thought it should be here for completion's sake, because, well, you never know. This is, a very bog standard and not exactly bad racing game. I didn't have too bad of a time with it, really. There's a lot of games like this on the PS1, and this game doesn't exactly compete with the best of them, but it's at least somewhere in the middle of a huge chasing pack. I wouldn't recommend it as such, but, it's average enough. And finally, we're in 1998. It's the last licensed title under the Ocean name, and indeed one of the last games under their name full stop. And actually, it is a major one. Mission Impossible on the Nintendo 64. By this time, Ocean had merged with Infogrames. The French company was on a big expansion kick that saw them acquire several companies, while Ocean was struggling. They were still releasing some successful games, but their overheads were already huge, and the onset of the 32-bit era only made budgets for games a hell of a lot bigger. They kind of needed to make this deal in order to stay alive. While the Ocean Infogrames merger was presented as a huge deal at the time, it didn't take long for Infogrames to gradually phase the Ocean name out, even though they arguably had a much stronger name value when it came to games. A couple of key company figures, such as Gary Bracey and co-founder John Woods, had left by this time, with others gradually following, and there were no new games under the Ocean name after 1998. This and a game called Viper on the PS1 were the last games released under the name, both games dating from July 1998. A licensed game like this one is kind of an appropriate ending, although there's more to it than just this N64 game. Ocean actually originally worked on 2 Mission Impossible games in 1995 when the film came out, and the first one would have been a cinematic platformer along the lines of Flashback, largely for 16-bit machines. This sounds more interesting than what eventually came out, but sadly it got cancelled, and there's only a couple of magazine screenshots. That was one version, while the other was a game for the N64 that was supposed to be one of the system's launch titles. However, the game was very delayed. The team assigned to it was based in America, and they struggled with the limits of the N64 as opposed to their ambitions for the title. When the merger happened, Infogrames took the game in-house and finished it for eventual release in July 1998. After all, the success of games like GoldenEye showed that you didn't necessarily have to time the release of a title with the movie in order for the game to be a huge success. If only this game was anywhere near as good as something like GoldenEye. This game certainly tries. It's a third-person title where you get all sorts of things. A bit of stealth here, a bit of action there, and a bunch of the big scenes from the movie and so on. With a bit more polish, this one may well have been really good. As it is, playing it is a frustrating experience where the controls are kind of needlessly complicated, and you're very restricted in what you can do. You kind of just have to stick to one path, and any deviation usually results in immediate failure, which is disappointing in a game like this one where you were supposed to be able to take multiple routes to an objective, according to how you chose to play the game. That was the original idea, but it just didn't come across. An ambitious title, and one that apparently didn't do badly sales-wise, but it is a game that falls short of the mark.
Try something else.
And that's it. We have covered all of Ocean's licensed games. Well, I hope so anyway. I appear to have talked about around 128 games, although this includes various multiple versions of titles and what have you. Needless to say, that's quite a lot. Hopefully in the process of doing so, I've done another extensive look at the history of one of the UK's biggest games companies. For better or worse, licensed games came to be the thing that really defined Ocean Software, and a lot of these games are very good, even if they certainly do start to flag towards the end of the 16-bit era. They still remain a pretty great company, of course. The licensed games are but one part of their catalogue, along with some excellent coin-op ports and pretty nice original titles. But it's always fun to see what they did with all of these licenses, whether the games were good, bad, or just plain weird. Hopefully you've enjoyed this huge video, and all that's left for me to say, as ever, is bye for now.